Just another evening at Cunhambebe State Park in the state of Rio de Janeiro. Biologist Marcelo Cupello, as he does every week, sits down to go through the pictures from the camera traps from the last few days. It's familiar work, almost mechanical. A bird, a branch swayed by the wind, a rodent scurried past the root of a tree. Nothing special, just the usual set of shots he had seen hundreds of times before. And then suddenly, Marcelo freezes. He stares intently at the screen, as if he can't believe his own eyes. His first thought is that one of his colleagues decided to pull a prank on him and slipped in a different picture. He calls over the other park employees, and a minute later, the whole group is gathered around the monitor. Everyone is looking at the screen and is silent, because no one fully understands what is happening. The camera trap had captured an animal that hadn't been seen in this area for more than 100 years. Marcelo scrolls to the next picture, and it leaves the whole group even more stunned. This time the animal isn't alone. Next to it are two young ones. One of the employees leans closer to the screen. Another asks about the date of the photo, as if there could be a mistake in the file. On the screen was a South American tapir, a large animal the size of a calf, calmly walking through the forest as if it had always lived there. But how did it get here? Where did it even come from? And if at least 3 individuals with young were caught on camera, how many of them are actually out there, in a forest that was considered empty of this animal for over a century? Cunhambebe Park is located in the mountainous part of the state of Rio de Janeiro and is one of the largest protected areas in the region. It is here that Marcelo Cupello has been studying the condition of the local forests for many years, which is why the unusual find immediately grabs the attention of specialists. That very same day, the researchers head out to the spot where the camera was set up. Large hoof prints are clearly visible on the damp ground, and fresh droppings lie nearby. Now, the photographs are no longer the only proof of the animal's presence. Each of these findings on its own could still have been a fluke. However, the pictures, tracks, and other signs all come together to form a single picture. Everything suggests that a small group of tapirs has been living in the forest for a long time, and not just one animal that wandered in by chance. The last official mention of the South American tapir in these parts dates back to 1914. After that, for decades, there wasn't a single confirmed sighting, so most specialists believe the local population had disappeared for good. Over this time, several generations of people came and went. The world went through wars, technological revolutions, and the rapid growth of cities. All this time, the enormous beast was either truly gone or was so masterfully hidden that it left no conclusive evidence behind. It's important to remember that over a century ago, researchers didn't have modern camera traps. Even the most experienced expeditions could only survey a small part of the vast forest, so a lack of sightings didn't necessarily mean the species had completely disappeared. The main mystery wasn't that the tapir was successfully photographed at all. It was much harder to understand how a large animal could remain unnoticed for so long right next to one of the most densely populated areas in Brazil. The South American tapir is considered the largest land mammal on its continent. An adult can weigh up to 300 kilograms, has a powerful body, and a short, flexible snout that helps it easily reach leaves, fruits, and young shoots. Despite its impressive size, the tapir is surprisingly cautious. It prefers dense thickets, comes out to feed mainly at night, and tries to avoid humans. This very secretiveness could well have been one of the reasons why its presence remained unknown for so long. A tapir's appearance seems unusual, even by rainforest standards. Its short, flexible snout has nothing in common with an elephant's trunk, but it's perfect for finding food. With its help, the animal easily plucks leaves, fruits, and young shoots from the dense vegetation. Scientists classify tapirs as odd-toed ungulates, so their closest living relatives are not pigs, as you might think at first glance, but horses and rhinos. Their common evolutionary line emerged many tens of millions of years ago. Over this huge span of existence, the tapir's appearance has changed very little. While some large mammals went extinct and others adapted to new conditions, this creature has kept a body structure that turned out to be surprisingly well suited for life in the forest. The young look completely different from the adults. Their dark fur is covered with light stripes and spots, which help the babies practically dissolve among the sun dapples and dense undergrowth, remaining invisible to most predators. This pattern only lasts for the first few months of life. The spots gradually disappear, the fur becomes a solid color, and the young tapir looks more and more like the adults. That's why the presence of babies in photos indicates that breeding is happening right inside this forest. For the ecosystem, the tapir plays a much more important role than its calm lifestyle might suggest. Fruits make up a large part of its diet, and along with them, the animal swallows large seeds that later end up far from the parent trees. Some plants are almost completely dependent on such large dispersers. Smaller animals are simply unable to swallow the heavy seeds whole. So it is the tapir that helps the forest gradually recover by spreading new trees over a huge territory. Despite its impressive size, the tapir has natural enemies. The main danger comes from the jaguar, which can attack even adult individuals. However, over millions of years, both species have learned to coexist, constantly adapting to each other. To escape pursuit, the tapir often heads for the nearest body of water. It is an excellent swimmer, dives confidently, and can remain almost completely hidden underwater for a long time, leaving only the tip of its short trunk above the surface to breathe. Predators have accompanied tapirs throughout their entire evolutionary history. Yet it was humans who proved to be a threat the animals did not have time to adapt to. The future fate of the species began to change long before the emergence of modern reserves and conservation programs. With the arrival of European colonizers, the pressure on the population began to ramp up quickly. Tapirs were hunted for their meat and durable hides, and this, combined with constant deforestation, gradually stripped the animals of their natural habitat and safe havens. The process of their disappearance stretched over many generations. The populations didn't decline because of one single major catastrophe, but slowly, piece by piece. Over time, tapirs completely vanished from many areas of southeastern Brazil, including the area around what is now Cunhambebe Park. At the same time, the Atlantic forest itself was changing. It once stretched in a continuous band along most of the country's coast, forming one of South America's richest natural systems, with a huge number of unique plants and animals. Today, only a small fraction of that forest's former territory remains. Instead of a single expanse, there are dozens of separate patches, divided by roads, cities, farms, and industrial zones, which make it much harder for large wild animals to get around. For small birds or some monkeys, such obstacles are not always impossible to overcome. However, it's a lot more difficult for a large animal weighing several hundred pounds to safely cross open spaces filled with people, traffic, and human activity. That's precisely why every remaining area becomes especially valuable. These forest patches become the last sanctuaries for animals that need vast spaces, reliable food sources, and the chance to live far from constant human presence. The paradox is that you can't really call the Atlantic forest some remote, wild backwoods. More than half of Brazil's population lives here. The country's largest cities are located here, and millions of people are just a few dozen miles away from these forests every single day. This is exactly why the discovery of the tapirs sparked so much interest. It wasn't about some remote preserve somewhere in the heart of the continent, but an area right next to one of the most densely populated regions in all of South America. After confirming the discovery, a new question arose for the researchers. If a small group really does live here permanently, how did it manage to survive in an environment where human influence is felt in practically all of the surrounding space? As of now, there is no definitive answer. However, specialists are considering several of the most likely explanations, each of which is based on the real features of the local nature, the history of the park itself, and the behavior of these exceptionally cautious animals. The first theory suggests that the tapirs never completely vanished. A small group could have remained for decades in the most inaccessible parts of the Atlantic forest, avoiding people, roads, and the places where scientific observations were usually conducted. At first glance, such an explanation seems incredible. However, the dense mountain forest is made up of numerous deep ravines, steep slopes, and almost impassable thickets. Even modern studies can only cover a fraction of such territories, leaving large areas practically untouched. The animal's lifestyle gives them an additional advantage. Tapirs are most active after sunset, move silently, and rarely linger in open areas. With such caution, the probability of a chance encounter with a human remains extremely low. If this theory turns out to be true, it will change scientists' understanding of the fate of the local population. It would mean that the disappearance existed only in scientific reports, while the animals themselves continued to live within their historical range all this time. The second theory explains the discovery in a completely different way. According to this hypothesis, the tapirs appeared in the park relatively recently, gradually migrating here from neighboring forest areas where small populations managed to survive much better. Such a relocation would be impossible without natural corridors connecting separate patches of the Atlantic forest. Even after massive deforestation, narrow strips of vegetation have survived between some areas, along which large animals are able to slowly move. If this is the very path that led the tapirs to Cunhambebe, it means that such corridors are still serving their purpose. This is an extremely important finding for conservation programs, as it confirms that fragmented forests still maintain a connection with each other. Furthermore, a discovery like this means that it's not just individual animals that are capable of moving. Given a safe route, entire family groups can gradually populate new territories, which significantly increases the species' chances of establishing itself in a new location. There is also a third explanation, which has less to do with the animals themselves and more to do with changes within the park. In recent years, the level of protection in the area has noticeably increased, causing the pressure from human activity to gradually decrease. After receiving official conservation status, the fight against poaching was intensified here. Illegal logging was reduced, and continuous monitoring of the forest's condition was expanded. As a result, the conditions may have gradually become favorable enough for the return of large mammals. None of the three hypotheses have been definitively confirmed yet. It's possible the real story combines several factors at once. The animal's elusive nature, the remaining natural corridors, and the gradual reforestation could very well have all played a part simultaneously. Whichever explanation ultimately turns out to be the most accurate, the discovery itself has already changed how specialists view the condition of this region. It showed that even ecosystems heavily altered by humans sometimes hold a much greater potential for recovery than previously thought. The story of the South American tapir gets even more interesting when you look at its closest relatives. Today, scientists recognize the existence of 4 modern species, each of which has adapted to completely different natural environments. Besides the South American species, there is the Baird's tapir, which lives in Central America, the mountain tapir inhabiting the high-altitude regions of the Andes, and also the Malayan tapir, the only member of the family living outside the American continent. The mountain tapir is considered the most unusual among them. Unlike its relatives, it lives at high altitudes where the temperature is significantly lower. Because of this, its body is covered in thick fur, which helps it stay warm in the cool climate. This species is so rare and elusive that observing it in its natural habitat is extremely difficult. Researchers get most of their information from automated cameras, which operate for months in remote parts of mountain forests without any constant human presence. A few years ago, the tapir family was once again in the spotlight of the scientific community. Researchers reported the possible discovery of another large species, an event considered exceptionally rare for modern mammals. Later on, some specialists began to doubt this conclusion. New genetic studies showed that the animals found might just be an unusual population of an already known species. That's why the question of their status as a separate species is still a subject of scientific debate. Discoveries like this don't just happen with tapirs. In recent decades, camera traps have repeatedly helped find animals that were thought to have disappeared from certain areas for many decades, and sometimes for more than a century. Every such case is a reminder of how incomplete human knowledge about hard-to-reach natural places still is. Modern technologies allow us to see what was hidden for years in dense forests, gradually changing scientists' understanding of wildlife. For the park staff, the discovery wasn't a reason for big announcements, but the beginning of a long haul. Photos alone weren't going to cut it, so the researchers continued to set up new cameras, track footprints, and gradually gather information about the elusive population. Over time, the camera traps captured the animals in different parts of the forest. This allowed them to roughly map out the territory the tapirs use, and also to understand which routes they most often take between their feeding and resting spots. The regular appearance of young animals turned out to be especially important. If calves continue to be born, it means the population isn't just surviving, it's sustaining its own numbers without relying on the random arrival of individuals from elsewhere. However, the small population size remains a serious problem. Any isolated group is much more vulnerable to diseases, natural disasters, and random events than a large population spread over a vast territory with a constant exchange of individuals. This is precisely why scientists are continuing to study the neighboring forest areas. If they can confirm the existence of other groups, it will give them a chance to better understand whether these groups connect with each other, or if they exist completely independently. The data obtained is important for more than just one species. Experts often use the presence of large herbivores to assess the overall health of an ecosystem, as these animals are particularly sensitive to habitat destruction and constant disturbance from humans. The tapir's return shows that even a heavily altered forest can gradually recover if given enough time and solid protection. This process takes decades, yet the results sometimes surpass the most cautious expectations of specialists. However, this story doesn't mean that nature is no longer under threat. Illegal logging, road construction, and the further fragmentation of forest areas still remain the main factors limiting the recovery of large animals. Therefore, the fate of this small population largely depends on the decisions being made today. Preserving individual forest plots is only important when there is still a way for wild animals to move safely between them. A single series of photographs has turned into a reminder that nature doesn't always fit neatly into human predictions. Sometimes the most incredible discoveries happen precisely where scientists had almost given up hope for good news. The story of Cunhambebe Park is a reminder of how carefully we should treat declarations about a species being completely extinct. Sometimes nature proves to be much more complex than we imagine, and a lack of sightings does not necessarily mean the animals are truly gone forever. At the same time, this discovery does not in any way diminish the scale of the problem. The South American tapir still remains a species threatened by deforestation, poaching, and the constant expansion of territories occupied by humans. This is precisely why every surviving population is incredibly important. Even a small group can preserve unique genetic diversity that, in the future, could help the species recover its numbers in places where it once disappeared. For the researchers, this story became a rare example of how many years of painstaking work can yield results. The decisive role was played not by luck, but by systematic observation, patience, and the continuous collection of data over many years. Perhaps somewhere in other remote corners of the Atlantic forest, there are still animals hiding whose existence specialists do not even suspect yet. Every new expedition has the potential to change our understanding of modern wildlife. That's precisely why discoveries like this generate so much interest throughout the scientific community. They not only add to the list of known habitats for individual species, but also help us better understand how complex natural ecosystems work. A single photograph became the start of a major scientific story. It served as a reminder that even after more than a century, nature is still capable of surprising those who continue to observe closely, ask questions, and search for answers in the quietest corners of the forest.